At the beginning of 1917, the Allies faced a grim reality. On the Western Front, Germany had withdrawn to the heavily fortified Hindenburg Line, making any attack costly and uncertain. The failure of the Nivelle offensive in the spring further damaged French morale, leading to widespread mutinies. At sea, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening to starve Britain into submission. And in the east, Russia teetered on the brink of revolution, its war effort all but over.
Britain was facing bankruptcy, and the war itself was at breaking point. The Allies desperately needed help. If they could persuade the United States to join the fight, Britain would gain access to vital loans, enough to keep the war effort going and avoid financial collapse. An American expeditionary force could tip the balance on the Western Front, bringing fresh manpower to break the deadlock and push the Allies towards victory.
However, by the time the United States joined the conflict in 1917, its forces lagged behind the realities of modern warfare. Meanwhile, Britain and France had already endured years of fighting that introduced revolutionary technologies and advancements in weaponry never before seen on any battlefield. In this video, we'll uncover just how much the US contributed to the Allied victory, both in combat and behind the scenes. The United States' path to war was not straightforward. Before they entered the conflict, a strong pacifist movement at home and a tradition of isolationism kept the nation on the sidelines. When war broke out in 1914, many Americans saw it as a distant European conflict that didn't concern them. However, Germany's actions in the Atlantic soon pushed the country's resolve to the limit.
As a neutral nation, the United States opposed Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, where any ship bringing supplies to Britain or her allies within the war zone could be targeted. On the 7th of May 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed, killing 128 American civilians. Germany claimed it was a legitimate military target, but the attack caused outrage across the United States. Yet the public's appetite for war remained minimal. President Woodrow Wilson entered into lengthy negotiations with Germany, securing compensation for the families of the victims and a promise to end unrestricted submarine warfare. In March 1916, however, the SS Sussex was also torpedoed. No Americans on board were killed, but it was a clear breach of the agreement. Germany issued the Sussex Pledge, promising again to stop attacking passenger ships.
In January 1917, Germany broke that pledge and resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The US government's confidence in Germany collapsed. The question was no longer if they would enter the war, but when. And in early 1917, a single message would change everything.
The Zimmermann telegram is perhaps the most influential piece of code breaking to have occurred during conflict, as it brought the United States into the war on the side of the Allies when they needed it most. This is a facsimile of the coded telegram and the deciphered message. In January 1917, British naval intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German minister in Mexico, revealing a German plan to give US territory to Mexico in return for their support should the United States declare war on Germany. The British shared the deciphered telegram with the United States government on the 24th of February 1917. This delay was in part to boost the growing anti-German sentiment, but it also gave them time to find a way of disclosing the telegram without compromising their advantage in code breaking or revealing that they had been monitoring American diplomatic channels. The telegram was reported in the press on the 1st of March 1917 and served as the tipping point, turning public opinion in favour of intervention. It highlighted Germany's ambition and aggression.
The United States ended their neutrality and declared war on Germany on the 6th of April 1917, joining Britain and France as an associated rather than an allied power.
This is a letter from King George V dated April 1918, which was given to American troops arriving in Britain on their way to fight in France in what he calls the Great Battle for Human Freedom. It is a cyclostyled letter. Cyclostyling was a way of duplicating a handwritten document before the invention of the photocopier, using a stencil to easily produce copies. This letter of welcome emphasised the close unity of the Allied forces who they were joining and served as a morale boost for the incoming US forces. It reads, "The Allies will gain new heart and spirit in your company." In the New York Times of the 1st of September 1918, it was reported that these letters were treasured by US soldiers as one of the most valuable souvenirs of the war.
In 1917, Britain was in deep financial trouble. After nearly 3 years of war, its gold reserves were almost gone, and the country was on the brink of bankruptcy. At the beginning of April 1917, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Andrew Bonar Law, warned that Britain could only finance 3 more weeks of spending. Without help, Britain would have been forced to abandon the gold standard, a move that would have slashed its purchasing power and crippled its ability to buy the materials needed to keep fighting.
The United States' entrance into the war offered the Allies hope. The move was a military boost and an economic lifeline. With American financial backing, the Allies could continue purchasing food, raw materials and vital supplies. To fund this effort, the US introduced Liberty bonds, similar to Britain's national war bonds. These campaigns were hugely successful. All 4 Liberty loans were oversubscribed, raising more than expected for the US government. The low interest rates on these bonds allowed them to lend to the Allies at rates far lower than the costly private loans they had relied on before.
By the latter years of the First World War, technological advancements were transforming the nature of conflict. The United States' entry into the war didn't just change the battlefield, it changed the balance sheet. With this new financial strength, Britain could further invest in the technology that would help break the stalemate that had defined much of the fighting on the Western Front.
After declaring war, US industry took time to reach the level of war production that Britain and France had already achieved. The United States had little experience in producing complete artillery pieces, so heavy artillery, tanks and aircraft were mainly supplied to the American Expeditionary Forces by the French. Much of their equipment was purchased in Europe, and most of the shells fired by them were French-made. This partnership between the United States and the Allies was essential. The US could not have equipped its army without Allied assistance, while the Allies relied heavily on American resources. Steel, copper, high explosives and propellant from the US were vital for armaments and munitions programs. US fuel supplies kept the Allied armies moving, the Royal Navy operational and the Air Forces flying. Among the most striking technological developments was the tank. Tanks were a British invention that were first used in action in September 1916. Tank crews endured hot, noisy and unhealthy conditions inside. This tank mask was designed to protect the wearer from splash or flying metal splinters caused by the impact of bullets hitting the outside of a tank's steel hull. In 1918, the Allies deployed their new tactics more effectively to break the stalemate on the Western Front, using artillery, tanks and aircraft alongside the infantry in a coordinated all-arms approach. As the fighting moved out of the trenches into the open, tanks were a key component in crushing obstacles and destroying machine gun posts. They were a new kind of weapon to integrate into battle plans, but particularly so for the American Expeditionary Force, who were learning this combined all-arms approach. By September 1918, the US Army had 2 fully trained tank battalions under Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton.
US troops were also unprepared for the realities of modern industrial warfare. They lagged behind in producing basic protective gear like helmets and gas masks, equipment that was essential on the Western Front by 1917.
The US Army had no steel helmet available when it joined the war. British helmets were supplied to the AEF until they could manufacture and supply their own. Between July and November 1917, a batch of 400,000 steel helmets were issued. This helmet on the mannequin here is one of those. Manufactured by Thomas Firth and Sons of Sheffield, it is typical of the Mark I type. This helmet and uniform were worn by Gilbert Veen from North Dakota, who first went into action on the 15th of March 1918. He served with the US 1st Gas Regiment. He was recorded as having participated in many actions, including the battles of St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. The AEF was largely unprepared for chemical warfare and heavily relied on the Allies to provide protection and gas shells. It is believed that Gilbert Veen was injured when their own gas was blown back towards them. He survived the war and was awarded a Purple Heart for his gas injuries.
America entered the First World War with troops unprepared for the realities of modern combat. The Allied powers and the US military needed to work quickly to transform the arriving forces.
President Wilson appointed General John J. Pershing to organise and command the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing, however, was preparing his troops for a 19th century war. He favoured massed frontal infantry assaults with rifle and bayonet charges, while the Allies had learned, through battles such as the Somme in 1916, that success required a combined all-arms approach. Veteran British officers were sent to America to advise and train US Army leaders in the new tactics of the Western Front, but the ordinary US soldier largely learnt on the job. They were often posted to quiet sectors to undergo frontline training with more experienced Allied troops.
Though Pershing fiercely insisted that American troops fight as a separate army, mounting pressure from Allied command forced a compromise. Selected US divisions were temporarily attached to seasoned British and French units, quickly learning modern tactics and proving more combat effective during the remainder of the war. Following heavy Allied losses in the German spring offensive, Pershing later agreed to send machine gunners and riflemen to support the front, rather than entire divisions.
The US also had little experience in flying or maintaining aircraft. The Allies had advanced aviation through the years of combat, so many American pilots were integrated into Allied squadrons, flying foreign-built machines. Ground crews trained alongside British mechanics at airfields like Duxford before heading to France.
It took over a year before the American Expeditionary Forces were ready to play a major role on the Western Front. The Allies, meanwhile, were planning for a decisive victory in 1919, and by then, the AEF aimed to be self-sufficient with over 4 million men.
The anticipated arrival of the US Army forced Germany to act sooner, launching their spring offensive earlier in 1918. Ironically, this accelerated the deployment of US troops to the Western Front. Some of the first soldiers of the AEF to encounter the enemy were railway engineers caught in a German counterattack at the Battle of Cambrai on the 30th of November 1917. Captain Hulsart and Lieutenant MacLeod were decorated for their gallantry on that day. However, the first major offensive involving US divisions was the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918, and it was not until August, when enough troops had arrived on the Western Front, that the United States First Army came into being.
In spring 1918, the Allies were exhausted and desperate. The German spring offensive had pushed them to the brink of defeat. However, the Germans had outrun their supply lines, and the fresh arrival of American forces was about to tilt the entire struggle in the Allies' favour.
By July, the initiative had shifted. The Allies launched the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, the opening of the 100 Days Offensive. The surprise attack at Amiens shattered German morale. Around 30,000 soldiers surrendered, and morale never recovered. General Ferdinand Foch, appointed Allied Commander-in-Chief in March, coordinated French, British, and later American forces. His strategy was relentless: consolidate gains, then strike elsewhere along the line. This stretched German manpower and resources to breaking point. The increasing number of US troops in France enabled the Allies to cover the front and keep pressing forward, turning survival into victory.
A month later, US forces were fighting the Battle of St. Mihiel. Fought from the 12th to the 15th of September 1918, St. Mihiel was the first and only battle planned and led by the US Army. It was a success, improving Allied positions and rail links. They captured the salient, but did not push on to capture Metz as planned. In reality, the Germans were already withdrawing, so the victory was easier than expected.
Just weeks later, the AEF faced its greatest test, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which Pershing described as the greatest battle in American history. Beginning on the 26th of September and lasting until the Armistice, it involved over 1 million US troops with around 120,000 casualties. The plan was to break through the Hindenburg Line and push into German territory, but inexperience and poor leadership contributed to their slow progress, and costly frontal infantry assaults were used to push forward. During this offensive came the incident known as the Lost Battalion, when 9 companies of the 77th Division were encircled by the Germans, as they did not realise that their flanking units had been pushed back. Over 500 US soldiers were cut off and surrounded for 6 days from the 2nd to the 8th of October. With no supplies and even subjected to friendly fire, they held out until reinforcements broke through, but with many casualties.
Following the initial attack at Musaragon, the Allies pushed forward relentlessly against German defences. The combined forces launched daily coordinated assaults along the Hindenburg Line, leading to the San Quentin Canal attack on the 29th of September 1918.
The British brought in 2 US divisions to relieve the exhausted Australians who had been fighting non-stop. The plan was for the Americans to break through the line, consolidate their position, and then the Australians would move through them to continue the advance. This worked for the US 30th Division, but for the US 27th Division, things quickly went wrong. A failed attack 2 days earlier had left troops scattered in that sector, so the usual creeping barrage was abandoned. A thick fog had descended on the battlefield, and they faced some of the strongest German defences. The Australians were forced to move up to support the Americans in 4 days of fierce fighting before they broke through and captured their objectives. Despite this setback, the Battle of St. Quentin Canal was an overwhelming Allied success and a turning point in the 100 Days Offensive. The complete breakthrough in early October signalled the beginning of the end for the German army. General Ludendorff reportedly said that the situation of the German army demands an immediate armistice in order to save a catastrophe. On the 4th of October 1918, Germany contacted President Wilson to discuss an armistice.
By November 1918, the combined weight of Allied offensives and the arrival of fresh US troops had broken German forces. Exhausted, short of supplies, and facing relentless attacks, Germany agreed to an armistice. By then, the American expeditionary forces outnumbered the British army and held a longer stretch of the front line. But despite their size, the British and French had captured more ground. The fighting stopped on the 11th of November 1918, and the world had changed forever.
This would have been a familiar object to British veterans of the First World War, but this is the US version of the Victory Medal. It has the same ribbon, but a different design on the medal. It is also sometimes called the Allied War Medal because it was issued by 14 of the Allied and associated nations. The United States version is the only one that has these campaign clasps on the ribbon. There were 13 Army battle clasps available for major ground operations. There was also this defensive sector clasp, which was issued to cover any action that the recipient was involved in that was not covered by any of the named battle clasps. This medal was issued to Harold Beckett, who was an American machine gunner serving with the 42nd Division in France. You can see he was involved in the battles of Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne and in defensive actions. He survived the war.
After the First World War, the US pushed for peace, but Wilson's 14 points clashed with the aims of Britain, France, and Italy, and the Treaty of Versailles only partly reflected his vision. The Senate rejected it, and in 1921, the US signed a separate peace with Germany, staying out of the League of Nations and weakening its influence.
However, President Wilson's ideas endured, and after another world war, the concept of an international body to mediate disputes regained support. In 1945, the United States became a founding member of the United Nations.
By the end of the First World War, around 2 million American troops were on the Western Front, suffering 320,000 casualties in just 6 months. Had the fighting continued into 1919, their growing strength would almost certainly have proved decisive. Yet America's greatest impact lay not only in manpower, but in the immense economic pressure it brought to bear on Germany. Once the 1918 Spring Offensive failed and the Allies counterattacked at Amiens, it became clear that Germany could no longer win the war. The arrival of US forces revitalised Allied morale at a moment of crisis. With the support and experience of Britain and France, the US Army rapidly transformed from a force suited to a 19th century conflict into a modern fighting machine. Together, these combined strengths overwhelmed Germany and helped bring an end to a conflict that had reshaped the world.